You have probably heard the statistic before, repeated in seminars, motivational posts, and business books for decades. Harvard, or sometimes Yale, surveyed graduating students in the 1970s about their goals. Only 3% had written goals down. 20 years later, that same 3% had accumulated more wealth than the other 97% combined. It is a compelling statistic. It is also, according to years of research by journalists and researchers who went looking for the original study, almost certainly fabricated, or at minimum, unverifiable and never actually conducted the way it is described. No original study has ever been located. Harvard and Yale have both, at different points, publicly stated they have no record of it. Brian Tracy's book on goal setting does not rely on that particular myth, but it exists in the same tradition, built around a claim that is genuinely defensible even without a fake statistic attached to it. People who set specific, written goals consistently outperform people who do not because of magic, but because of a set of concrete psychological and behavioral mechanisms that Tracy spends the entire book breaking down into a repeatable system. His core argument is that success is not the product of luck, talent, or circumstance nearly as often as people assume. It is the product of clarity, specifically the difference between a vague wish and a clearly defined, written, deadline-driven target, combined with consistent daily action toward it. Tracy's claim is that this is learnable, mechanical, and available to essentially anyone willing to follow the process, regardless of where they are starting from. In this video, I want to walk through the actual mechanics of the system he lays out, not the vague, inspirational version most people have already absorbed secondhand, but the specific steps, and where, honestly, the book's confidence outruns what the underlying research can fully support. Stay with me. Clarity before everything. Tracy opens with a claim he treats as foundational to everything that follows. Lack of clarity, not lack of ability, is the single most common reason people fail to achieve what they want. Most people, he argues, have only a vague, general sense of what they want, something like more money or a better relationship, without ever forcing that vague wish into a specific, measurable, time-bound target. The specific mechanism he describes is that the human mind, particularly what he calls the subconscious, cannot effectively work toward a target it cannot clearly identify. A vague goal produces vague effort, spread thin across many half-considered directions. A specific goal, by contrast, concentrates attention and effort the way a magnifying glass concentrates sunlight, and Tracy argues this concentration effect alone accounts for a significant share of the difference between people who achieve what they set out to and people who do not. He illustrates this with a distinction he returns to throughout the book between a wish and a goal. A wish is passive, something a person hopes will eventually happen without necessarily specifying how or by when. A goal, in his definition, is active by construction, because the act of making it specific automatically forces decisions a wish never requires, decisions about timeline, about what success actually looks like in measurable terms, and about what would count as having genuinely achieved it rather than simply moved vaguely in its direction, writing it down. The next step in Tracy's system is the physical act of writing the goal down, not simply forming it clearly in thought. He argues that written goals function differently from goals held only mentally, becoming a kind of explicit contract with yourself, one that is considerably harder to quietly abandon or redefine downward than a private intention never committed to paper. The specific claim is that the act of writing forces a level of precision thinking alone rarely achieves. Vague ideas can survive comfortably in the head, shifting and softening whenever they become inconvenient. The same idea, written down in specific, concrete language, has to actually be specific, and Tracy argues that this forced precision is doing real cognitive work, independent of any question of subconscious programming or motivation. He also recommends a specific practice many readers find more demanding than it sounds: rewriting the same set of goals by hand, in full, on a regular basis, sometimes daily. rather than writing them once and setting the page aside. The rationale is repetition of exactly the kind of forced clarity the initial writing produced, keeping the goal continually specific and current rather than allowing it to drift back into vagueness once the original page has been filed away and forgotten. The seven-step method, Tracy's core practical system, the one the rest of the book builds toward, breaks into a specific sequence. Decide exactly what you want in clear and measurable terms. Write it down. Set a firm deadline, and if the goal is large, set intermediate deadlines along the way. List every obstacle standing between you and the goal, honestly and completely. List the knowledge and skills you will need to acquire. List the people whose help or cooperation the goal will require. And finally, make a specific plan, organized by priority and sequence, and take some action on it every single day without exception. The specific insight underneath this sequence is that most goal-setting advice stops at the first step or two, deciding what you want and maybe writing it down, and calls that sufficient. Tracy argues this is where most people's goal-setting actually fails, not in the wanting or even the writing, but in the absence of a genuinely honest accounting of obstacles and requirements, which most people skip because it is considerably less pleasant than the wanting and writing were. He is specific about why the obstacle list matters more than most people assume. A goal pursued without an honest inventory of what stands in the way tends to collapse at the first real obstacle, not because the obstacle was unusually severe, but because encountering it unprepared triggers doubt about whether the whole goal was ever realistic in the first place. The same obstacle, anticipated in advance and already planned around, tends to be absorbed as an expected step rather than treated as evidence the goal should be abandoned. Daily action and momentum. Tracy places heavy emphasis on the requirement of daily action, however small, arguing that consistency matters considerably more than intensity in determining whether a goal is eventually reached. A modest action taken every day compounds in a way that occasional bursts of intense effort, followed by long gaps, generally does not. The specific mechanism he points to is momentum, both psychological and practical. Each day's action, however small, makes the next day's action easier to take, partly through simple habit formation, and partly through the accumulating, visible evidence of progress, which Tracy argues sustains motivation far more reliably than willpower alone ever does over a genuinely long timeline. Momentum interrupted, by contrast, tends to be considerably harder to restart than it was to maintain, which is part of why he treats consistency, even in small doses, as non-negotiable within the system. He is direct about what this rules out in practice. Waiting for a large, uninterrupted block of time or an ideal burst of motivation before acting is, in his framing, one of the more reliable ways a goal quietly stalls, because that ideal window rarely arrives on schedule, and every day spent waiting for it is a day the underlying momentum was allowed to go cold instead of building, removing limiting beliefs. A significant portion of the book addresses what Tracy calls self-limiting beliefs, internal assumptions about what a person is capable of that were absorbed, often in childhood, and that quietly cap ambition long before external circumstances ever do. He argues these beliefs function almost like an internal thermostat, keeping a person's effort and expectations within a familiar range, and that a goal significantly outside that range will often trigger unconscious self-sabotage unless the underlying belief is identified and directly challenged. The specific technique he recommends is deliberately examining the evidence, or lack of it, behind a limiting belief, treating it as a hypothesis to be tested rather than a settled fact about your own capability. He pairs this with repeated visualization and affirmation, mentally rehearsing the achieved goal in specific, vivid detail, which he argues gradually shifts the internal thermostat upward, making the previously uncomfortable target start to feel achievable rather than presumptuous. Tracy is specific about a common failure mode he sees here. People frequently set a goal that is, in fact, entirely realistic given their skills and circumstances, and then quietly sabotage it not through any external obstacle, but through a private, unexamined belief that people like them do not achieve things like that. The goal was never the problem. The unexamined ceiling on what felt permissible was, and Tracy treats identifying and challenging that ceiling directly as at least as important as any of the more mechanical steps in the process. Now let us be honest about this book. Tracy writes with genuine clarity and momentum of his own, and the seven-step method he lays out is specific, actionable, and considerably more rigorous than the vague vision board advice found in much of the genre. That specificity is a real strength, and it distinguishes this book from a large share of comparable goal-setting titles that stop at inspiration without ever building a repeatable process. There is, however, a fair scientific caveat worth naming clearly. Actual goal-setting research, most notably the extensive body of work by psychologists Edwin Locke and Gary Latham, does support the core claim that specific, difficult goals reliably outperform vague or easy ones across a wide range of tasks, and Tracy's emphasis on specificity and deadlines is genuinely consistent with this well-established literature. But that same research tradition has also produced a more cautionary body of findings, sometimes summarized under the phrase goals gone wild, showing that rigid, narrowly defined goals can produce real downsides when applied carelessly, including tunnel vision that causes people to neglect important considerations outside the stated goal, reduced intrinsic motivation once a task becomes purely about hitting a number, and in some documented business and organizational cases, an increased willingness to cut ethical corners specifically because a goal was set aggressively enough to make cutting corners feel necessary. Tracy's book, written primarily for individual motivation rather than organizational goal design, does not engage seriously with this more cautionary research, and readers applying the system at scale, particularly in a team or business setting, would benefit from that additional context the book itself does not provide. It is also worth noting plainly that some of the psychological framing in the book, particularly around the subconscious and superconscious mind, and their supposed mechanisms for goal achievement, rests on considerably less rigorous scientific footing than the practical behavioral portions of the system. The behavioral advice, write it down, set deadlines, take daily action, break down obstacles honestly, stands on solid empirical ground. The more mystical language layered around it is better understood as motivational framing than as established psychology. So what do you actually take from this? The most immediately actionable idea is the shift from a vague wish to a specific, written, deadline-attached target. Take whatever you currently want in only general terms and force it into a single, specific sentence with a number and a date attached, and notice how differently it sits in your mind once it can no longer hide behind vagueness. The second useful idea is the obstacle list most people skip. Before committing to a plan, write down every real obstacle standing in the way, honestly, including the ones that are uncomfortable to name. A goal pursued without this honest accounting tends to collide with its first real obstacle unprepared, while a goal pursued with it tends to treat the same obstacle as an already anticipated step rather than a surprise setback. The third thing is simply this. Consistency in small, daily action is doing more of the actual work than any single burst of motivation ever will, no matter how intense that burst feels in the moment. The goal that gets reached is rarely the one pursued with the most excitement on day one. It is the one still being worked on, in whatever small way, on the ordinary days when nobody would have noticed either way. None of this requires believing in a fabricated Harvard statistic, or in the more mystical language the book occasionally reaches for. The mechanical core of the system, specificity, a written plan, an honest reckoning with obstacles, and daily action sustained past the point where it stops feeling exciting, holds up on its own, with or without the more dramatic claims layered around it. Thanks for watching all the way through. The Harvard study may never have happened. The underlying idea, that clarity plus consistent action beats vague hope every time, did not need a fake study to be true in the first place.